So let's go ahead. We'll start it up. My mic is live. Welcome. My name is Robert Reinhardt. I'm following up Jan's session with yet another H.265. I don't want to call it a debate session. I'm, as a video solutions architect, I help my clients come up with the best solution for today and for the foreseeable future. And everything that is in this HEVC versus VP9 versus VP10 versus AV1 is a very futuristic conversation. It's not going to affect your revenues this year, most likely. I don't know. I would say across the spectrum. I mean, the more I think about it, and I'd hardly call myself an Apple fanboy. I just got my first iPhone after being on Android for however long Android's been out. And I mean, I'm a Mac guy, but I haven't been an iPhone guy. Apple still sells HD content at 720p. So, I mean, if you go to the iTunes store, you're not even buying 1080p content yet. I mean, for most titles, at least all the titles I've bought on iTunes are 720p. And so, I don't know. I'll get to some of that stuff after I present some data. And I'm mainly a tech geek. I'm in tech solutions that are cost effective and that are going to serve the clients that come to me the best. I'm not going to stick on the session description. You've been through it. Here's my contact information. I know people leave sessions and because they got to get to calls or other sessions. I would love to be sitting on other sessions right now too, but there's only so much time in the day. I'll probably put that up at the end as well. So let's just start with some good news. I've given this session for at least 5 streaming media conferences, and I keep using the same material and the same scripts. I add more scripts to the battery of tests that I've conducted, and you can see through my strike-throughs that H.265, X.265, and that's the codec that I'm using. Jan even said in his last session that of all from the Moscow University tests that they released, I think that was earlier this year, at the end of last year, X.265 was the best HEVC encoder. And I don't want to say that goes without saying, but there's so many people, and I was saying this before I started my session, X.264 as a premium H.264 encoder still isn't widely employed by lots of people. They're using main concept. They're using other vendors out there. They're using workflows they established over a decade ago or close to a decade ago. There's just so much to be gained just by using X.264. It's just gravy with X.265, right? So if you've got a channel that's going to be effective for HEVC, I would hope you would consider X.265 because it's probably going to be your best bet if you're in the HEVC camp. But as Jan was pointing out, the patent pool, HEVC Advanced, there's still some mystery around just how much it's going to cost to implement HEVC. You can start learning X.265 today and using it if you use FFmpeg. It's pretty easy to start using X.265. And X.265 has gotten steadily better and better every time I've presented this. There hasn't been as much change between November and now. When I last presented this session, it was pretty much getting to that 2-to-1 hype that we've heard about throughout my tests. But when I started delivering this session, it wasn't close to 2-to-1. The bad news, of course, is that we've got much longer encoding times, and there's not much we're going to be able to do about that on current hardware. I mean, everything gets better when you get better hardware thrown at it, and X.264 is going to encode the same content faster than X.265, of course, without the file savings or bitrate reductions that are in the hype. But it does take almost twice as long if you're using the switches. And again, I did some sort of vanilla tests this time around. Unlike my past presentations, I've started to drill in on static GOPS instead of or fixed GOPS, and how that might affect ABR delivery using HEVC. So that's some new data that I'll present this time. Jan already stated this in his last session, but unless you've got hardware decode on a device or your laptop or wherever you're playing it, you're just going to see higher CPU utilization for any software-based codec. That goes without saying. And that's also, I don't want to keep harping on the H.264, but I don't think that we're going to start removing H.264 decode anytime soon from devices, right? There's too much H.264 content out there. And I don't think, it's not like Apple's going to just remove GPU acceleration for H.264 in even 2 years. They just wouldn't do that. So as long, and Jan also pointed out that H.264 was really made viable because of a company like Adobe. It was my latest column that's on streamingmedia.com and in the latest magazine makes that point, that if someone would step up and fill the divide like Flash did for whatever the next codec's going to be, then that's going to be the codec that wins. Anything that's going to create near ubiquity, and I don't think these days it's possible to create the type of ubiquity that Flash did for desktop. There's just too much fragmentation. You've got OTT, you've got devices, you've got your tablets versus desktops, and like Jan said, at the end of the day, consumers don't really care. As long as it looks good and it plays well, that's what matters. And when you see people from CDNs showing projections of how bandwidth costs continue to go down and network availability continues to go up, well, some of these arguments about codecs saving this much over this codec may not play out as much. 10 years from now, are we still going to be quibbling over 500 kilobit quality? I don't know. Probably not. I would hope we're not looking at really low bit rates because, not that it'll be a Star Trek universe, but who knows? I don't know how the the Federation agreed on a codec there. It probably took a long time. And of course, Jan pointed that out too about battery life, right? That's the biggest concern. I saw Kristen Henry present at, I think, Stream Media West, trying to make the case that everyone should just put VP9 into their mobile apps. Well, you can't just put a software codec into mobile apps that are consuming a lot of video. You got to drain your battery. Like Jan's, you'll get half as much battery life if you play a lot of video out of your device. Quite frankly, most devices don't hold their charge after a year, so that's probably the bigger concern I have with battery life. But anyway, H.265 is tomorrow's tech. I currently don't have any client that is demanding H.265 encoding workflows, and I have clients across the board. I have lots of small startups that are really cash-strapped, as well as very large enterprise companies that are trying to deliver DRM content to OTT. And they're all H.264 workflows for the foreseeable future. With that one specific vendor that I'm working with DRM delivery, they are working with this very specific hardware vendor that's going to distribute this content. So it's a very isolated silo. But even they're not looking at HEVC right now. That's not what the value proposition is around. But they are very concerned about bandwidth on site to these devices. So that's where we can be saved with some of these codecs, right? Because if they can reduce bit, hotels are great use cases, right? Because you got a lot, especially at events like this, you got a lot of people competing for bandwidth. I'd hate to see how much bandwidth is being used during, late hour. I'm from the West Coast, so I come here and I can't fall asleep. I'm going to watch more IP-driven content. I'm sure other people in the hotel are. That's a lot of competition for even in New York at one hotel. There's you got a few hundred people trying to stream even 1 megabit content, 3 megabit content. That's a lot of bandwidth for one site. Testing today, this is primarily what I do. I'm a geek, so I compile all the time. I'll compile H.265 straight from the source. There's so many guides. You don't need to be a tech geek to start playing with H.265, and it's all free. You don't have to go and buy some trial version of something or where it's time limited or there's watermarks. You can do all this just by using a few terminal prompts on a Mac. It is way harder to compile on Windows. But hey, you could spin up an Amazon Linux instance and start compiling FFmpeg there and be done with it. Do all your tests on the cloud, wherever. You have so many options, there's no excuse to start testing today. I make the case that, I could, and I joke about this because you look at, with a lot of technology, you look at the fringe elements. With photography, it was always about the taboo, right? When photography first came out, what were people using photography for? Well, not the highest moral standards, that's for sure. When it comes to a codec, where am I seeing HEVC used most today? Torrents. I see a lot of TV shows that are being pirated finally. This is the first streaming media I can come to and say, I'm finally seeing torrents out there. I'm not saying I'm downloading them, but I'm seeing them out there advertised as being HEVC. And they're all smaller. And what idiot who's trying to illegally download content want to choose the smaller file over the bigger file, right? It's going to take less time to download, so they're going to love it, right? That's a no-brainer. So I should have added to the benefits of H.264. If you're into pirating, H.265 is your friend. Go ahead and use it, but I'm not here to advocate piracy. I'm just saying that's where I'm seeing it finally make an uptick compared to the last 2 years when everyone's been talking about it. So when the masses of geeks that are sharing TV shows and other licensed content illegally are starting to use it, then clearly there's something good about it. I don't see a lot of VP9 content out there that's torrented. Not yet, at least. If you have, I'd like to know, because it would be interesting to just add to a spec. I've been using the same machine. It hasn't died yet, so to keep my testing consistent, I've always used this Mac. There's the specs. The only thing that's changed is the operating system. I did have an aberration in November when I presented at Stream Media West. For some reason, the version of H.264 that I had compiled was not performing as well as the others. It looks like it's returned to normal now in the last few months since I've been, I don't know if there were some known bugs in a particular release, but that's one of the, when you're pulling straight from repositories for these codecs, you're getting the latest and greatest. It might be marked as stable, but someone could have introduced a regressive bug where something comes back that they thought they'd fixed, and then someone else broke it with some other code commit. But these are the versions I'm testing against, and I'm going to start going into some demos. Actually, before I go into the demos, I should have put this after it. So Jan sold me on this Moscow University analysis tool last summer when I was reading some of his articles. And so when I was prepping for Streaming Media West, I started using this tool to augment. This was the one. If you've been to this session of mine before, I just did subjective analysis. Like, yeah, watching it play, it looked better. And I've only had results confirmed with the VQMT tool. It's not a cheap tool. I think Jan probably has a discount code that'll save you $50 on it if you're interested in buying it. It's about $1,000 for this analysis tool. But it's well worth it if you want to be in the business of comparing qualities, just even with different bit rates or different settings with H.264. You don't need this tool just to get excited about new codecs. So you'll see here that what I have displayed here is a very generic preset. I'm letting FFmpeg really do a lot of the driving for the preset. The only thing I specified was a CRF of 21. That's the constant rate quality control that you can use with both H.264 and H.265. That's one of the primary differentiators as a codec API, if you will, that the X codecs have over all the others. Most of them are bitrate controlled codecs. You look at main concept, they don't have anything like CRF added to it. Maybe they have recently, but they're late to the game, too late. So CRF is one of those things where, hey, I don't care if I've got a sports clip or a talking head clip. If I specify a CRF of 21, I'm going to get, relatively speaking, the same quality out of CRF 21 across all sorts of content. So it removes a lot of that decision-making of like, well, does this clip need 300K? Does it need 500K or whatever? Obviously, it's all relative to so many other factors. File size isn't going to stay small just because you choose a CRF value of one over the other. It will, given everything else staying consistent, a lower CRF will produce a bigger file and a better quality file for it. So CRF of 18 is going to be better than 21. The default for H.264 is 23. The default for H.265 is typically 28, although I think they're playing around with that. And they're saying that 28 is the new 23, but my tests aren't showing that yet. So if you look at FFmpeg's track page on using H.265, they'll say what I just told you. 28 is the same as 23 with H.264, but I think that results will vary, and they shouldn't really, because again, it's a quality value. It's not a bit rate, bit budget kind of approach. And you'll see with this CRF, with this first test, where I'm not playing with a lot of values, I'm letting FFmpeg's presets under the hood really control everything other than CRF. So these aren't fixed GOPs, they're dynamic GOPs. They're all, the keyframe placement's all over the place. This isn't going to be great for HLS delivery or anything like that. And you can see that the file size is not 2 to 1. I've got a 51.1 megabyte file from 265, and I've got 79, almost close to 80 megabytes for H.264. Definitely a cost reduction in terms of bit rate, and if I zoomed in pretty close on the graph that the VQMT tool produces, and the H.264 is slightly better. If you can see on my slide, Jan was posting those same type of decimal values. Lower's better, so the H.264 had a 0.4491. H.265 had a 0.5284. That's a pretty big difference. If you were looking at those numbers that Jan presented, they were all pretty close with his VP9 and HEVC comparisons. So even though the H.265 is smaller and took almost twice, and this is for an X-Men trailer, that's about, I think it's 154 seconds, so about 2.5 minutes. So it took longer than real time to encode it with H.265. Less than real time to do it in H.264, and the results are super close. I mean, if you look at these graphs, when you zoom out, they almost blur. You can see that the red is almost consistently below the blue, but there's not huge differences in terms of quality, and based on the literature, you would think that CRF 21 would be substantially better than CRF 21 on the H.264 side if they're saying 28 and 23 are similar in terms of quality. So I don't buy that yet, and I wouldn't expect, if there's one thing you take away from that, don't believe that particular assertion on the FFmpeg track wiki page where they talk about it. Here's another comparison, and I'll play these videos too so you can sort of get a sense of what's going on there. But here I did exactly what that track page said should be equivalent, a CRF of 23 on H.264 versus a 28 on H.265, and the differences just became more pronounced. The file size definitely got substantially smaller on the H.265. It went down to 21 meg from, what was it before? It was 51. So it really substantially cut the file size down. The CRF of 23 really, only added marginal gains on the H.264 side because we were just going from 21 to 23, not from 21 to 28 like on the H.265. And this separation is greater. Is it enough to make a difference perceptually to the end user? I'll let you be the gauge. I'll be posting all these results and the scripts that I generated these values from. There's no scripts with the measurement tool, but my FFmpeg command line options, they're just text files, so they're easy enough to share. And the files are all pretty small that they output. I don't know if I'll share the video because it's just going to be a massive download if I add up all the clips. And then the last graph I'm going to show you, and I did more than these tests, but these are the ones that I highlighted on. I chose the Superfast Preset, which is, as the number shows, super fast. It took 15 seconds to encode on H.264, 61 seconds on H.265, and this is where it got interesting because this is where I didn't use CRF. I used bitrate controls. I used 500K consistently, and the quality. This is the only time I saw the blue actually go below the red. So red again here is H.264. Blue is H.265. So this is when I bitrate throttle, and this is what really I liked this test because it confirmed what I have always believed about HEVC. people always tote that it's going to be this savior for 4K, and I don't doubt that it can be. But where I really see the savior right now, if only it was on devices, is that if I'm stuck watching a 500K stream because my bandwidth won't allow it on a 3G or 4G network, or even in a hotel room where hundreds of other people are competing for bandwidth, I'm going to see a better picture. I will see a better picture at 500K with HEVC, and it's going to be, again, file size. We're not looking at file size differences here. We're looking at better quality for the same bits going in, and that would be fantastic, right? So I would love it if we started to see SD resolutions or even low, like 540p resolutions start to go down because, and allowed more utilization of those qualities over lower bandwidth. That would be fantastic. And that's where, again, in terms of my testing, that's the only time I really saw when I started to control some variables. Actually, did I have one more? Oh, I didn't. Let me go back. Sorry, I didn't mean to get to my last slide because I'm going to start showing more stuff. Where's my, oh man, did I not, where's the fix? Oh, sorry, so not only, I skipped over that point on the second to last one. When I did the CRF versus 23 versus 28, I also started to, I introduced another confounding variable, and that would be restricted GOP. So I did a 10-second GOP. In this case, it's a 240 frame GOP because it's a 24 frame per second sample as a trailer. I turned scene threshold to 0 so that it couldn't create anything in between. And I verified that those keyframe intervals were fixed using MP4 box. I showed that in my workshop yesterday, how you can use MP4 box to make sure that you've got closed GOPs and that they're occurring where you want them to. And this was interesting too, that with a closed, with a fixed GOP, that we were seeing, not tremendous differences between H.265 and H.264 in terms of quality. But again, this was more substantial of a gap where I zoomed in here on this particular difficult piece. I mean, when you're, any of these transition spots and trailers, obviously, especially for action films like X-Men, are more difficult to encode and have way more scene transitions and cuts than you would in, normal content that you're watching. It's not an easy clip to transcode. Okay, let me, I guess before I start going into demos, I'll ask if there's any questions so far. Any questions? All right, well, let's just start comparing some clips. And I like starting with that 500K clip because I think that that's the most compelling argument. If someone were to say to me today, hey, Rob, if everything was, all things considered equal, we had, HEVC decoding across mobile devices faster than we would with any other codec, what would you be most excited about? I wouldn't be excited about 4K content because most of my clients aren't producing 4K content yet. And we're the same position we are right now when 1080p content first came out with networks. I mean, it's going to be at least a few years, I think, before we start seeing it. I bought a 4K TV at Christmas time and returned it because I was just, not satisfied with the tech. Everything I heard Janta say reinforced that I don't want a smart TV unless it has a super powerful CPU in it that can software decode anything. I don't want to buy any smart TV now that has a baked GPU accelerated. I guess I'd be okay if it had maybe 10 HDMI ports, so that if I had a different vendor HDMI that were, had their hardware decoder on the HDMI thing, that would be acceptable because that's a cheap upgrade to a TV that you might spend a lot of money for. My wife hated the 4K TV. When we were watching The Martian, she thought it looked super real. I had to turn on every cinematic filter on that Sony TV to bring it down and soften it to make it look the way that she expected it to work at a movie theater. She thought it looked too much like it was shot on a soundstage. And of course, most of it probably was shot. It's like Mars, right? But anyway, a lot of CG there. But anyway, that's obviously subjective. And I'm running out of file space. So let me go and just bring up, let me see here, the 500K. I've got a lot of 500Ks here. Let me make sure I picked the right one. That's the other reason I know HEVC hasn't made it yet. I don't have thumbnails of any of the HEVC content. H.264, no problem. When I start seeing thumbnails here, I'll start feeling like that whole BitTorrent feeling I had about, pirated content. Like, hey, it's finally there. I don't have any icons for it showing up my showing previews here. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the. Let me make sure I've got an equivalent here for this in H.265. I do. So here's the 500K H.264, and I'm going to just play this full screen. I've got some audio, and so again, this is H.264. If we could bring the house lights down just a bit, that would be fantastic. I don't care if I'm underexposed.
You're gonna find this hard to believe.
Is it possible? Oh, there we go.
I was sent here for you. From the future.
So we'll start to see, it's really in those shadow details. I like this clip a lot because of that.
In the beginning.
So this is 500K with H.264, and it's just using. I don't even think I adjusted main profile. It's probably using high profile because it's just going with the default. By default, it's high profile. So it doesn't look horrible, but when I show you the H.265 with defaults applied, it's substantially better. So I'm going to just stop right there. And again, this was one of the clips I used in that DQ test. So I'm going to make sure I pick the equivalent for H.265 here. And I'll go ahead and play this one. And I keep, historically, all of my copies from past tests. So I've got all these same clips from every other test I've done for this session.
You're going to find this hard to believe. I was sent here for you.
And you'll still see artifacting, right? This is hardly, and as the VQMT results show, we didn't always get lower numbers. But again, on the 500K, this was substantially better on the VQ, and you can see it, right? You don't need VQMT to see that this has way less artifacting and shadows, looks way better. I would be, if I was getting this on a mobile phone right now or on a tablet, I'd be really impressed that this was 500K content coming down the pipe. Whereas all that other stuff that I saw with H.264, that's what I've come to expect. But again, as I started this session, I'm a firm believer. I could probably make that 500K look a little bit better. I could slow down, use a very slow preset in FFmpeg. It's just using the default, which is medium. I could increase some reference frames on there. I could do some things to improve that H.264 quality more so than what you saw there. But I could probably do the same thing on the HEVC side, right? As you all know, the devil's in the details with codec manipulations and hardware. When you start, the fragmenting is going to make so much more difficult, right? I dread to know what I can get away with HEVC on smart TVs that have it now versus 3 years from now, right? They're probably going to be a restricted set. So stuff that I encode for TVs 3 years from now may not play very well, right? There's a reference frame restriction, for example, with H.265 based on B frames and B pyramid approaches that didn't exist with H.264. Reference frames in general, just as if you typically, that's the one, if I have a vendor, big or small, that comes to me with encoding issues with devices or a particular set-top box, reference frame counts almost typically are the culprit. They used way too high of a reference frame count. Even the defaults with H.264 are way too high. If you don't manipulate reference frame count, they can be as high as 14 to 16, which is the max that the specs allows. And so much hardware fails if you've got that many reference frames, right? So you have to dial it back. I had to, on one, we had to dial it back to 4 reference frames in order for that content to play. All the other bells and whistles really didn't matter. It was when we started to reduce that reference frame count because that's a lot for the decode buffer to manage. The more reference frames you allow, the more that decode buffer has to really work hard to keep that picture stabilized. Anyway, so that was a 500K. And then I want to show, where, so that was really to show the quality difference that you get when you keep bit rate static. with the CRF approaches, I'm going to show the CRF 23, which I should have pretty. Let me sort by date. Oh, it's date modified. That was the last ones I did up here. So they're going to be up towards the top. So here's the 23. Did it grab the right one? Yeah, 23. So this is CRF 23, and I'm going to show with H.264, and I'll show you CRF 28. So again, all things. So this is, again, quality-based approach. Look, it's not going to look bad, right? I mean, the whole point of this is that we don't see the artifacting that we were seeing at 500K. You'll still see on some of these transitions, it can get blocky. Some of the fade up, it's still a little blocky. And this is, again, CRF 21 with H.264.
To guide us, to bring us together.
And I'll just stop it right there. And again, this was one that I ran that I'll go back and show you, just to remind myself. This is the graph we're looking at. And I just run, by the way, I run that analysis tool just with VM Fusion on my Mac. So this is the results that we're looking at right now. I just showed you the CRF 23 that produced this result. So the H.264 is better than the 28, but not by, it's not like we've got a really huge gap on most of these parts, but it is consistently, you can see that the red is better than the CRF 28, and it is a fixed gap. So this would be an approach to adaptive streaming that I would employ. Most of my clients come to me for adaptive streaming. The trends that we've heard definitely ring true with all of my clients. I would say across the board, everyone is looking at streaming content with subscription content or even pay-per-use or rental periods for content. We're not looking at like the Apple TV. I'm downloading a singular file that's super high quality to replace the whole Blu-ray DVD scenario to grow my library that's permanent or as permanent as we can think of it. It is a streaming game, and most people are playing by those rules. I thought, as an aside, that we would start to see more of the Louis C.K. attitude come out, where people who had the resources would start producing their own content and selling their own content directly. So far, that hasn't really played out, unless I'm missing some big news headlines from other celebrities trying to do that. Maybe that's because OVPs are getting better at cost-effectively making an offering where revenues exchange. I can't say. I'm going to now play the CRF 28. Go ahead and bring the lights down one more time. This is the last clip I'll show.
I was sent here for
and
from the future.
This look, again, it's going to have slightly less quality than the H.264 that we just looked at. You're going to probably notice a little bit more blocking in those shadow details than we saw before. But was it substantial enough, again, in terms of bit rate and file size that was utilized with this example? And I'll just let it, I like that, where you get to see the highlight on Hugh's head. So again, going back to my slide, the file size here is pretty remarkable. So what I just played you there was a 21 megabyte file versus a 50. So that's better than 2-to-1 in terms of file savings over H.264 for a fixed GOP approach. I was pretty impressed, and that was main profile even. I imagine if I had chosen to use high profile for that piece, that we would have seen an even bigger gap between H.264 and H.265. But, and probably some cost savings on the H.264. We would have seen a slight, it would have probably been closer exactly to 2-to-1. We're actually greater than 2-to-1 here, like I already mentioned. But that's really the update I have to post in this. Again, I don't want to sound too, it doesn't depress me to say that we should just stick to making our H.264 encoding strategies better, because I still think there's a lot of room there. In fact, in the panel next door that Jan's now a participant on, they're discussing that very thing, how ABR strategies can be more qualitative in approach and less these fixed bit rate tiers, like everything's going to go through at 1080p at this bit rate, everything at 720 is going to go through at this bit rate. There's just, I don't know why that's such revolutionary thinking, but and I think it's mainly my only assertion there is that when you've had commercial vendors like Main Concept pushing their approaches, well, it was all about bit rate. It really wasn't about quality. I mean, they had VBR and CBR, but CRF is a much better approach as a concept to qualitative controls, right? Because you have a numeric system where, hopefully, and this is what I'm really upset if this is really the dichotomy they want to present, that, 28's the new 23. Well, it didn't play out in my tests, and I would just hope that, that's like saying, like, I'm wearing a certain size shirt. Oh, well, medium now is this in the new shirt line that we just came out with. No, medium should be medium. It should be a fixed qualitative approach, even from a perceptual scale. And so that's sort of upsetting that might be the way they're positioning it. I'm sure that can change. I think that's largely just rhetoric that has to be updated. And I bet if I talked to some codec engineer, they'd be saying something differently about that CRF dichotomy that we see there. But I hope that's not terrible. I mean, again, I've never professed to any client or any session or in any session that you should start using HEVC today or even VP9 if it makes sense to the workflow that you have. If you're Google and you own YouTube, it makes absolute sense for you to use VP9 for a ton of content because a lot of people are coming to your content using your technology, and you're going to save a lot of money doing it. It doesn't matter what the rest of the world does. It matters what you do as Google in that scenario. What does it matter for most people that I know who are trying to monetize or even just get content out there, even if it's not monetized, even if it's just like some fishing manufacturer trying to show how a new piece of equipment works. It's a free video to download. I'm probably just going to recommend an H.264 approach for that because that's what makes sense. It's what's got the most penetration out there. Am I going to encourage them to use baseline like I see so many people still using? Probably not, because H.264 baseline is clearly no longer this lowest common denominator anymore. I mean, there's lots of devices out there still that can probably only do H.264 baseline, but there's far more now that can do more than baseline than there were 5 years ago, right? I mean, even the cheapest smartphone out there today is going to be able to play, well, I shouldn't say that. Maybe there's some knockoff brand that only has baseline decode. I don't know. There probably is, but I would bet you that less than 1% of all new devices are that restricted in their capabilities. So that's the good news, is this that if you're looking at your encoding pipeline now, chances are you can improve it. And so many of the commercial vendors, like Telestream, I don't know if Harmonic has embraced H.264 with licensing. I used to keep up with Harmonic, but Telestream has been offering a value add with H.264 for a long time now. If you work at an enterprise where they really get scared when you mention open source. I mean, there are commercial licenses, by the way, for H.264 and H.265. And so if you're using FFmpeg workflows, the devil's in the details, right? I mean, that's what's so crazy. I mean, when it comes down to these licensing arguments, well, it's all about how big you are and how much content you have out there. I would say, I always raise as a red flag to any client of mine that's using FFmpeg or even H.264 in general, hey, I'm not a lawyer, but be aware of these licensing pitfalls that you should be mindful of, because everyone likes to think they're going to grow to be the next biggest thing, like Netflix or whatever, with their new video platform. And you'd be surprised how many people think that they can build Netflix for less than $1,000, right? It's just like, sorry, it's going to take a lot of resources and a lot more money than what you think you've got. I mean, and it's sort of sad that way. Like I wrote my latest column that I wrote that will probably be in print next month for Stream Media was largely based on someone who came to me. She's a Hollywood producer, working with a friend to try and get some e-learning content on there in a very specific market for e-learning, and they were licensing content to go into their videos, and they had these crazy DRM requirements. I shouldn't say crazy, but very vague DRM requirements. And I even pushed back on her and said, well, you got to go back to this person, this company that you're licensing content for your e-learning content to really drill down on DRM requirements here, because they didn't even endorse specific vendors. They said they suggest that licensee licensor suggested looking at some of these Chinese companies that I'd never heard of for DRM. They weren't like buy DRMs and Verimatrix and vendors like that. They were like low-cost DRM that I would actually question the value of what that DRM is that they're providing. Is it really securing that content any more than some obfuscation methods would? But again, coming back to like where we are right now in all these different ecosystems, you still have a lot of people still moving from Flash to HTML5. HTML5 is hardly there in terms of all the stuff that Flash brought to the table. I've always said that. It's in Apple and Google's interest to limit HTML5 and not make it as performant as Flash was. You still can't get full screen APIs with mobile video in a mobile browser. So what is everyone forced to do? Make native apps. Is it cheap to make native apps? Who in here believes it's cheap to make a native app? No. Is it a lot cheaper to make a website? Yeah, it is. I can tell you categorically. I didn't mean that to be rhetorical, because I think that there's a pretty good answer to that. And so what I find depressing right now where we are with all this video stuff and all the streaming stuff is that it's a very complicated picture now. It's only going to get more fragmented. It's not going to get less fragmented. There's going to be less ubiquity with any of these technologies. And Apple so far has really been the driver for a one-size-fits-all approach with H.264 and HLS, right? Because so much content is H.264, HLS, just because. And there's a reason, because everyone wants their content to work on iOS. I don't care how hard Microsoft and Google try to make a codec permanent. They can make it work in their workflows. But if they want to sell to everyone who's on iOS, then they're going to have to they're going to have another flavor. Can they afford to have as many flavors as they're proposing? Yeah, they can, but I don't know how many small content producers are going to want to encode an AV1, a VP9, and an HEVC version of everything. I mean, how many people here had a variant to H.264? I'm just curious. How many people were encoding in VP8 or VP9 to augment their H.264 content? Not one of you are raising your hand, and then I just can't believe that there's going to be, and there's a reason for that. Because you want things that aren't going to produce, like when you're talking about video and huge assets, I don't care how cheap storage gets on S3, you're going to have, everyone from your database administrators to your software devs, if you start having to track, n number of assets for every piece of content in your catalog. Adaptive is enough of a headache for most software developers to tackle in terms of content management. Just having, even 5 bit rates for every piece of content is enough. Multiply that by 4 or 5. I mean, you're just talking about an unrealistic picture. So that's where I think the average producer is just going to look at this picture and say, you know what, I'm sticking with H.264. I mean, how many people have updated to Dash yet? I'm just curious how many people have Dash players out there in any of their products. A couple of you. That's good. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't have a Dash player, but I'd put more eggs in the let's have a Dash player than let's look at HEVC or VP9 as our new codec, right? Because you're talking about player tech that enables you to replace, again, older Flash legacy experiences. And I really, really hope, I mean, if I had one big wish, and it's not even related to this session, I would love to see the HTML5 full screen API adopted across the board. So every mobile device could go full screen, and you could control that full screen experience. It would reduce all these app installations. You'd have almost as much control that you expected from a Flash experience back in 2006 and 2009 to be available on a mobile browser today. That would be amazing. Is there anything stopping Google? Google is better at this, by the way. Chrome does support the full screen API, but no other vendor that I'm aware of. I'd have to bring it up. There's that caniuse.com site where you can list a feature and it shows you the penetration. If you look at full screen APIs in HTML5, it's still where it was 2 years ago in terms of mobile. There's just not support there for it. And there's a reason why Apple's not giving it away, because, again, when it comes to a plug-in environment, Apple did not destroy Flash because it was this, massive CPU hog. It was, don't get me wrong. It prevented Apple from making money with the App Store, right? Because if you could take a Flash experience or any experience that ran natively in the browser and could do everything a native app could do, access the camera, do whatever your app does, then why would you let Apple take 30% of your revenue on an App Store when you can make a website that anyone could reach where you don't have to factor that into your revenue? I mean, Jam made the same case when they tried to have royalties for H.265 on content and revenue sales from. They just said, no way, that's not going to fly. The only reason I think H.265 said that mindset is there, I think, is largely because of the App Store mentality. Like, nowhere in any other industry is a 30% margin, except, do credit card companies charge you 30% of your sale? Hell, I mean, no, we would have, they probably would, if they tried to do that now, you'd probably see more people adopting Bitcoin strategies. I don't know. They'd be like, no way I'm going to give it. But everyone just sort of stepped aside and said, okay, well, I want to be on the iPhone, so if I have to pay 30% of my app sales to you for that, then go for it. That's also why there's no mistake that subscription-based revenue is the way to go if you're in that market, right? The Lynda.coms, the Netflixes, are they giving a percentage of their subscription revenue to Apple? No, because their app is free. They don't sell it. They make their money through subscription. Apple knew that going into it. Google knows that going into it. But I think it was that mindset that made the early adopters or early license planning for H.265 be that crazy. But hey, Apple's getting away with it. Why don't we make our codec work the same way? Like, let's keep taking more and more of this pie up, and then what are you left with at the end of the day in terms of revenue for your content? Not as much. So, yeah, I guess I should finish my rant, and that that will. I'm already over, but I will. We're into our lunchtime. I'll be happy to entertain some questions if you have them. Otherwise, I'll be floating around here till Thursday morning, so feel free to grab me. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.